we're living in a multi-dimensional universe, and there's at least 11 dimensions. Otherwise, the universe would collapse. Each dimension is a 90-degree angle right above the next one, compactified. So they're sitting right on top of us. So within less than a Planck unit of space above you, there's another dimension that actually exists with a whole nother universe happening simultaneously while we're sitting right here. And from higher dimensions, they experience time differently. Time really doesn't exist. The past, present, and the future happen all at once. So somebody, for example, from the fifth dimension would look at us and they'd be able to see us. Imagine us in this building here, but imagine when I first walked in, and imagine us in here, and imagine me like in the bathroom or something. They'd be able to see us in all the different rooms. The different rooms represent different time frames of existence within this structure. So they can see the past, present, and future at the same time.
So is the idea that when you're in a higher dimension, you can see below lower dimensions, but you can't see dimensions above you?
Exactly, unless you have the capability of matching. First, you have to obtain the frequency of a higher dimension and then match that frequency to be able to walk in. So, for example, my hand is stopped now by this table. Why is it stopped? I'm not really touching the table. There's repulsion going on. Electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons in my hand is repelling the electrons in the table. You don't really touch anything. Now, if I can match the subatomic frequency of the atoms in this chunk of wood here on this table with my hand, I would be able to pass my hand right through this table unscathed. Why? Because atoms are 99.999% empty space. Nothing is really here. Everything is only a light wave slowed down to a particular frequency. And so if you can match frequencies, you can merge with things. You can walk through walls and all that kind of stuff. The things that seem paranormal could be advanced beings have tapped into some type of understanding of how to match different frequencies in our dimension and appear apparitional or paranormal. But in true reality, they could just be taking a peek in.
And how did we come to the understanding that these higher dimensions exist? Like, what is the most basic evidence that we have of this?
Quantum physics proves it. See, when we look into the quantum world, everything changed. In standard physics is where we are right now, on the large side of physics. But the smaller you go, the more weird things get. We find that particles transphase in and out of existence, and they go to different dimensions. We even know now that some of our synapses of our thoughts in our brain phase out of this dimension and they go somewhere else, and then they come back again. And this has all been tracked and traced through the understanding of quantum mechanics and quantum physics and understanding that dimensions exist. The biggest way that we made a model of this is we figured out how to create something called quasi-crystals. Now, these quasi-crystals are these multi-dimensional crystals. We actually created an 8th dimensional quasi-crystal. We created in a laboratory using different technologies. And then from that 8th dimensional quasi-crystal, it casts a shadow of itself down to a 4th dimensional quasi-crystal, which then casts down a shadow which creates a sphere. So we know that the universe is most likely the shadow of a higher dimension. We're living in a light matrix, which is actually a light matrix, which is a shadow of a much higher dimension. And so we know this because they created these crystals, these quasi-crystals, and when they put them at different angles, they cast shadows. Sometimes
what do these crystals look like?
They look like, have you ever seen Adinkra codes?
I think I've heard you talk about this before. No,
they look like Adinkra symbols, mathematical symbols, but in the third dimensional time space. And so if you take them and pull them out into a third dimensional time space, they look like these lines that are connected with these nodes like that.
This is a quasi-crystal.
Yeah. It's an ordered structure, but it's not periodic. If you put 8th dimensional quasi-crystal, it's a fractal. It's all about fractal. We live in a fractal holographic universe. The quasi-crystal is a fundamental basis of the fractal holography that we're living in. We're fully immersed in it, so we can't detect it, but we're living in a light matrix. And that's what the Adinkra codes also prove. Professor James Gates Jr. University of Maryland, former scientific advisor to President Obama, he put together a team of the most incredible supersymmetry and theoretical physicists in the world, like the top brains in the world on this. And they started analyzing what is the ether of space-time. What is this soup that we're living in, that we're inhabiting, this universe? What is it? What is it made of? What's powering it? They discovered something called Adinkra codes, which go back to the ancient Dogon tribe from Mali, Africa. The original inhabitants of the land of Cam then moved to Mali later after they were thrown out, taken over at one point. But they still kept this ancient knowledge in Mali about these Adinkra codes, and they would draw these patterns. Well, he discovered that these patterns are actually mathematical codes. And these are not just any mathematical code. They're actually the codes that describe the ether of space-time itself. They're error-correcting codes, the same exact codes that run our search engines and web browsers that we're using right now to look at the image. There's coding behind that screen that runs this, what we just did. And guess what? It's the same code that runs the universe. So we discovered that we're living in a programmed light matrix. These are depicting the nature of reality. And they actually are mathematical programming code. They're a special type of code, though. They're error-correcting codes. The same type that Google browser is running on is the same thing that runs the universe.
What does this tell us, and where do we take this? Like, what is obviously this is like foundational knowledge for us, but like, where do you see it going?
Well, if you understand that we're living in a fractal holographic light matrix, it doesn't mean we're not real. But it tells us, wow, this is the method of the creation. Now we're getting closer to understanding what we really are. We understand now that consciousness isn't made inside this avatar body, that the avatar body doesn't even exist, that consciousness is a stream of something, coming from somewhere else and is being picked up in this matrix with this coding. If you took all the humans on Earth, there's 8 billion humans on Earth. If I took all 8 billion humans and removed the empty space between their atoms, I can fit every human into a sugar cube. One sugar cube can hold all 8 billion of us. You can see atoms are empty space. So if you take the empty space out, you collapse it into one sugar cube. All 8 billion can fit in one sugar cube. So what does that mean?
Wild.
What's here? There's only one consciousness, it seems. And it's like a radio station that's transmitting out a frequency from a higher dimension. Our avatar bodies pick up that frequency. You're 99.1, I'm 99.2, he's 99.3, but it's still coming from the same source. And so we're all coming from the same source. It's like the universe has found a way to live subjectively through multiple entities, but not even through entities, even through objects that we consider to be man-made, because every atom we know now in quantum physics is also conscious.
Imagine you're reading a story, but instead of it being printed on the pages of a book, it exists in a space you can't see or touch. This is a bit like the concept of a multidimensional universe that Billy Carson speaks about. In our daily lives, we're used to dealing with 3 dimensions, moving forwards and backwards, left and right, up and down. But what if I told you that there are more dimensions out there, ones that we can't see or feel? This idea comes from a field in physics called string theory. Think of it like a guitar. When a string vibrates, it makes a sound. In string theory, everything in our universe is made up of tiny, vibrating strings, and each vibration makes up the things we see around us, like stars, trees, and even ourselves. But for this theory to make sense, scientists believe there need to be more than just our 3 dimensions. In fact, they think there could be up to 11 different dimensions. Now, why 11? It's not just a random number. In the world of physics, the math works out perfectly when you include these 11 dimensions. These extra dimensions aren't something we can touch or see, but they could be hiding in plain sight, folded into the universe in ways that are too small for us to notice. It's like if you were a character in a book. You might think your world is just the page you're on, but there are so many more pages and chapters that you're not aware of. This idea changes the way we think about everything around us. It's like discovering that there's a whole new world hidden within our own, full of mysteries and wonders waiting to be explored. Dimensions and how they fit together. Let's try to understand how these dimensions are connected to each other. Carson uses the idea of dimensions being at right angles to each other. In a world with only 2 dimensions, like a piece of paper, you have length and width. Now add depth, and you've stepped into the 3-dimensional world where we live. But what about a 4th dimension? How does that fit in? Thinking about another dimension beyond R3 is tricky, because it's not something we can see or experience. But let's use our imaginations. Imagine time as a sort of 4th dimension. We move through time just like we move through space, experiencing each moment one after the other. Carson also talks about dimensions being compactified. This is a fancy way of saying they're folded up so small that we can't see them. Picture a very thin wire. From a distance, it looks like a simple line, one-dimensional. But if you look closer, you can see it has length. And if you could look even closer, you'd see it has thickness, and even a tiny bit of width. The extra dimensions in string theory are like this, but even smaller. so small that we don't notice them in our daily lives. These hidden dimensions could be all around us, filled with things we can't even begin to imagine. It's like if you lived in a two-dimensional world and suddenly discovered there's a whole three-dimensional world above, below, and all around you. This idea opens up a universe of possibilities where countless different realities might exist right next to ours, just out of sight. The concept of time in higher dimensions imagine time as a river, flowing from the past to the future. This is how we usually understand time. But what if time was more like an ocean, where past, present, and future exist all at once? Billy Carson introduces us to this fascinating concept, suggesting that in higher dimensions, time doesn't work the way we think it does. In our three-dimensional world, we experience time linearly. One thing happens after another. But in higher dimensions, time could be experienced differently. It's a bit like watching a parade from the street versus watching it from a tall building. From the street, you see the parade one float at a time as it passes by. But from the building, you can see the entire parade all at once. Carson talks about beings from a fifth dimension who might see our three-dimensional world in a way we can't imagine. For them, looking at us might be looking at a book where they can see every page at the same time. They could see us in multiple places, our past, present, and future, simultaneously. This idea challenges our usual understanding of time and suggests a universe where time is far more complex and multidimensional than our everyday experience. Interactions between different dimensions now. How do these different dimensions interact with each other? Carson suggests that to see or interact with a higher dimension, one needs to match its frequency. This is like tuning into a radio station. Just as you need to be on the right frequency to hear a particular radio station, beings in one dimension need to tune into the frequency of another to interact with it. In our everyday life, this is hard to grasp because everything we touch and see is in our three-dimensional world. But what if we could tune into these other dimensions? Carson suggests that the paranormal could be explained by beings who have figured out how to do this, to match the frequencies of different dimensions. Think about atoms, which are mostly empty space. If we could somehow match the frequency of our atoms to the frequency of a wall's atoms, we might be able to pass through it. This sounds like something out of a superhero movie, but in the realm of physics, it's a theoretical possibility. It suggests that what we consider solid and unmovable in our world could be more flexible and permeable than we ever imagined. Quantum physics and higher dimensions quantum physics might sound like a complex and distant concept, but think of it as the rulebook for how things work on a really, really small scale, much smaller than anything we can see. In Carson's discussion, this microscopic world reveals the existence of higher dimensions. In quantum physics, particles do some pretty wild things. They can be in more than one place at the same time, and they can pop in and out of existence without warning. Now imagine particles as tiny messengers traveling between dimensions. When quantum physicists observe these particles, they sometimes find them behaving in ways that don't make sense in our three-dimensional world. This is because these particles could be influenced by forces or laws from these higher dimensions. Just like a puppeteer's strings can control a puppet's movements from above, these higher dimensions could be influencing the particles we see in our world. This idea shakes the very foundations of what we understand about our universe. It suggests that the universe is like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and quantum physics is showing us pieces from parts of the puzzle that we didn't even know existed. It's as if we're getting a sneak peek into a hidden realm, opening doors to new worlds that operate under completely different rules than our own. The human brain, quantum mechanics, and dimensional phasing. The human brain is an amazing organ, but imagine if it had abilities beyond what we know. Carson suggests that our brain synapses, the tiny gaps between neurons where signals pass through, might actually be tapping into these higher dimensions. Think of your brain as a radio, not just picking up signals from our world, but also tuning into frequencies from these other dimensions. This might sound like science fiction, but in the world of quantum mechanics, it's a possibility that scientists are beginning to explore. There's evidence to suggest that these synapses are involved in processes that defy conventional physics, like being affected by quantum entanglement, a phenomenon where particles remain connected so that actions performed on one affect the other. no matter the distance between them. Carson's idea here is that our thoughts might sometimes phase in and out of these higher dimensions. It's like when you daydream, and part of your mind wanders off to a different place. What if, in those moments, your mind is actually interacting with another dimension? This could explain moments of extraordinary inspiration or creativity, as if we're tapping into a vast network of knowledge and experience that exists beyond our physical realm. The universe as a shadow of higher dimensions. Imagine if our entire universe was just a shadow cast by a much more complex reality existing in higher dimensions. This idea, as Carson suggests, is looking at the shadow of a tree and trying to imagine the tree itself. The shadow is a simpler, two-dimensional version of something much more intricate. In this analogy, our universe is the shadow, and the higher dimensions are the tree. The concept of a light matrix comes into play here. Think of it as a vast network or web of light, stretching out in all directions, far beyond what we can see or understand. This light matrix represents the higher dimensions, and our universe is a projection or a shadow of this much more complex structure. It's as if we're living in a 3D movie projected from a realm that's far more advanced and multidimensional. This perspective shifts our understanding of reality. Instead of seeing our universe as the entirety of existence, we can start to view it as just one level or aspect of something much larger and more intricate. It suggests that what we experience as reality might just be a small slice of a much vaster multidimensional cosmos. Quasi-crystals and dimensional shadows. Quasi-crystals are a perfect example to illustrate this concept. These are structures that are incredibly ordered, yet don't repeat themselves like normal crystals. Think of it like a complex mosaic pattern that never exactly repeats. Scientists have created quasi-crystals in the lab that are projections of higher dimensional patterns. When Carson talks about an eighth-dimensional quasi-crystal casting a shadow to a lower dimension, he's referring to how these complex structures can provide us insights into higher dimensions. It's similar to how a three-dimensional object can cast a two-dimensional shadow. By studying these shadows, or quasi-crystals, we can start to understand the shapes and patterns of the higher dimensions that we can't directly perceive. This is groundbreaking because it allows us to study and explore these higher dimensions indirectly. It's like deciphering a secret code that tells us more about the universe and our place in it. These quasi-crystals are not just physical structures, they're like windows into the higher dimensions of the universe, revealing a reality that is much more complex and interconnected than what we see in our everyday lives. Adinkra codes and the ether of space-time picture a world where every aspect of reality, from the movements of galaxies to the swirling of atoms, is governed by a hidden code. This is where the concept of Adinkra codes, as discussed by Carson, comes into play. Adinkra codes are like the universe's programming language, complex mathematical symbols that describe the fabric of space-time itself. They're not just abstract concepts, these codes are thought to be the actual blueprint of reality. Adinkra codes find their roots in ancient African symbolism, but their modern interpretation in physics suggests something profound. They are seen as error-correcting codes, similar to those used in computer algorithms to ensure data isn't lost or corrupted. In the context of the universe, these codes could be ensuring that the fundamental processes of nature run smoothly. Imagine the universe like a giant computer, and these Adinkra codes are its software, keeping everything running without glitches. This idea transforms our understanding of space-time from something passive, just a stage where the events of the universe unfold, to an active participant, governed by a set of intricate mathematical rules. It suggests that the reality we experience is underpinned by a complex underlying structure that we're only just beginning to understand. Consciousness beyond physical bodies. Now let's turn to one of the most intriguing aspects of Carson's ideas: consciousness. The nature of consciousness. Often, we think of our minds as being produced by our brains, contained within our physical bodies. But what if consciousness is more like a broadcast, being picked up by our brains like radios picking up a signal? This perspective sees consciousness not as something generated internally, but as something external that we tap into. This idea is radical because it suggests that our sense of self, our thoughts, and our awareness might originate from outside our physical bodies, probably even from another dimension. It's like the brain is a receiver, tuning into a frequency from a vast ocean of consciousness that exists beyond our physical world. Carson takes this further by suggesting that all humans, and potentially all life, are connected to this single source of consciousness. It's akin to the idea that every radio, regardless of its location or design, can tune in to the same station. This connection could explain experiences of deep empathy, intuition, or even psychic phenomena, as instances where individuals are tapping more directly into this shared stream of consciousness. The illusion of physical existence and universal consciousness. Have you ever considered that what we see and touch might not be as solid as it seems? Carson introduces a mind-bending idea. Our physical reality might be more illusion than actual substance. He brings up an astonishing fact about atoms. They are 999% empty space. If you remove all the empty space within every human on Earth, you could fit the entire human population into the volume of a sugar cube. This notion turns our understanding of physical existence on its head. It suggests that what we perceive as solid and tangible, buildings, mountains, or even our own bodies, is mostly nothing but empty space. It's like discovering that a seemingly solid sculpture is actually made of thin air, held together in a specific form by invisible forces. Moreover, Carson proposes that this illusion of physical existence is tied to a single, universal consciousness. Imagine if every radio in the world was tuned to the same station. Similarly, he suggests that every human, every living being, might be tuned into the same frequency of consciousness. This idea paints a picture of unity and interconnectedness that transcends physical boundaries, implying that at the deepest level, we are all part of one vast, interconnected whole.